September 19th, 1944. Somewhere near Réchicourt-la-Petite in northeastern France, Lieutenant Edwin Leiper peered through the morning fog that clung to the rolling hills like wet wool. His M18 Hellcat sat hull down behind a slight depression on Hill 246, engine ticking over at idle, the Continental radial motor barely audible over the sound of his own breathing inside the open-topped turret. 30 feet ahead, emerging from the grey curtain like a ghost materializing from smoke, came the unmistakable angular muzzle of a German tank gun. Then the glacis plate. Then the distinctive sloped armour of a Panther tank, 45 tons of the most feared armour in the Wehrmacht arsenal, its long 75mm gun capable of punching through American tanks at ranges where return fire remained ineffective. Leiper's gunner had already traversed onto target before the lieutenant's order reached his lips. The Hellcat's 76mm gun roared, the breech slamming backward as the vehicle rocked on its torsion bar suspension. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Through the acrid smoke, Leiper watched the tracer arc into the Panther's side armour at the turret ring, the only angle where his gun stood any chance of penetration. The Panther shuddered, stopped, then erupted in orange flame as ammunition cooked off inside. But there was no time for celebration. 4 more Panthers were emerging from the tree line, their commanders scanning for the source of fire that had just killed their lead tank. "Back, back, move it now!" Leiper was already screaming the order as his loader slammed another round home. The driver dropped the transmission into reverse and gunned the throttle. The right radial screamed, all 400 horses catapulting the 18-ton vehicle backward at a speed that would have flipped a Sherman onto its back. 15 seconds after firing, they'd moved 200 yards laterally, using a fold in the terrain to break line of sight. 25 seconds, and they were setting up in a new position 300 yards from where they'd fired, this time with a clear angle on the Panther's vulnerable flanks, as the German tanks pivoted awkwardly to engage ghosts that were no longer there. This was the M18 Hellcat at war. This was the doctrine that American tanker destroyers had drilled, until it became instinct, the tactical mathematics that traded armour for velocity, protection for positioning, and transformed a lightly armoured vehicle into the most effective tank killer America would field in the European theatre. This was shoot and scoot, and the story of how it came to dominate the fields of France begins not with that foggy morning near Réchicourt, but with the catastrophic collapse of France 4 years earlier, and the terrifying question American planners asked themselves while watching newsreels of German panzers racing toward the English Channel. The fall of France in June 1940 shocked American military observers in ways that transcended simple tactical surprise. German armoured divisions hadn't just defeated French and British forces through superior firepower or numerical advantage. They had fundamentally demolished the existing paradigm of warfare through operational velocity that existing defensive doctrine couldn't counter. In screening rooms at the War Department in Washington, senior officers watched grainy footage of panzer columns streaming through the Ardennes, punching through defensive lines that were supposed to be impregnable, reaching the Channel coast in 10 days of sustained advance that turned the entire Allied position in France untenable. The French army, considered the premier military force in continental Europe, had collapsed not because its tanks were inferior in individual combat, but because German doctrine emphasized speed and exploitation over methodical advance. General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, recognized immediately that America faced a crisis of capability rather than mere equipment shortage. The United States Army in 1940 possessed approximately 400 tanks total, most of them obsolete light tanks with guns that couldn't penetrate modern armor. American infantry had virtually no organic anti-tank capability beyond 50 caliber machine guns, weapons effective against the tanks of 1918, but useless against a Panzer III. The industrial capacity to build thousands of heavily armored breakthrough tanks simply didn't exist yet in American factories. Ford's assembly lines were churning out civilian automobiles. General Motors was producing Buicks and Chevrolets for the consumer market. The nation that would eventually outproduce the entire Axis combined was in 1940 barely capable of equipping a single armored division to European standards. American planners faced a fundamental problem with no obvious solution. If German panzers crossed the Atlantic, the United States lacked both the equipment and doctrine to stop them. Building armor thick enough to withstand German guns would require years of industrial development and vast resources America didn't yet possess. Matching German firepower ton for ton would demand manufacturing capabilities that didn't exist. So, American tactical theorists did what Americans do when confronted with an impossible problem. They changed the rules of engagement. If you can't build armor thick enough to stop German guns, don't try to absorb the hit. If you can't match panzer firepower in direct slugging matches, refuse the direct engagement. Instead, build something fast enough that the enemy never gets a clean shot. Mount a gun powerful enough to kill from ambush. Train crews to hit and vanish before return fire arrives. The tank destroyer force was conceived in November 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor forced theory into urgent practice. Its motto, "Seek, Strike, Destroy," wasn't merely catchy marketing for recruiting posters. It represented operational doctrine distilled into 3 words that would reshape American anti-tank thinking. The philosophy represented a radical departure from everyone else's approach to armored warfare. Soviet heavy tanks featured armor measured in inches, designed to absorb dozens of hits while grinding forward through enemy fire. German doctrine emphasized coordinated combined arms tactics with tanks, infantry, and artillery moving as integrated battle groups. Britain built specialized tank destroyers like the Archer, but treated them as defensive assets positioned to protect static positions rather than mobile hunters. The Americans proposed something that sounded insane to European ears, at least initially. Lightly armored vehicles that would actively hunt enemy armor using speed and aggressive maneuver to offset their vulnerability. The concept wasn't defensive interdiction. It was offensive pursuit. Tank destroyer battalions would operate independently from tank or infantry units, held in mobile reserve until enemy armor threatened a breakthrough, then rushed forward to blunt the attack using superior positioning and tactical flexibility. Critics within the army called it suicide, dressed up as doctrine. The Tank Destroyer Board called it pragmatic mathematics applied to industrial reality and tactical necessity. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce, who would become the driving force behind tank destroyer development, envisioned units equipped with something faster than a tank, mounting a better gun but accepting less armor to enable the speed that would keep crews alive. He wasn't interested in vehicles that could trade blows with panzers in direct frontal engagements. He wanted platforms that could dictate the terms of every encounter, engaging when conditions favored attack and disengaging when tactical geometry turned unfavorable. By December 1941, the doctrine had been formalized into field manuals that would guide American tank destroyer operations throughout the war. Tank destroyer battalions wouldn't hold ground. That was infantry's mission. They wouldn't support advances in the traditional sense. Tanks handled that role. They had one job, crystallized with brutal clarity: kill enemy armor before it could exploit gaps in American lines. Speed was essential because tank destroyers needed to reach threatened sectors faster than enemy tanks could exploit them. Firepower was essential because first-shot kills eliminated the return fire problem that plagued less capable systems. Armor was deliberately sacrificed because in American calculations, a vehicle that never got hit didn't need thick steel, and the weight savings from thin armor translated directly into the velocity that enabled survivability through positioning rather than protection. This wasn't a minor philosophical difference from existing armored doctrine. It meant American factories could build 3 tank destroyers for the resources needed for 1 heavy tank. It meant crews trained on entirely different tactics than Soviet or British counterparts, emphasizing maneuver warfare over defensive attrition. And it meant that when the M18 Hellcat finally reached production in July 1943, it embodied these principles so purely that even its designers harbored private doubts about whether crews could survive in something that fast and that exposed. The M18 Hellcat didn't look like a conventional tank destroyer when the first prototypes emerged from Buick's Flint, Michigan engineering studios. It looked like something designed by engineers who had been told to maximize a single variable, speed, and accept whatever compromises that maximization demanded. The hull was a welded steel construction with sloped armor that measured 1 inch thick at the glacis plate, the thickest protection the vehicle possessed. 1 inch. A German 88mm shell could punch through that at 2,000 yards and keep going, the armor offering no more resistance than sheet metal against a rifle round. The side armor was even thinner, barely 3/4 of an inch, meaning even obsolete anti-tank guns represented lethal threats at close range. The turret sat open to the sky, an enormous tactical vulnerability that left the crew exposed to everything from artillery airbursts to sniper fire to grenades dropped from upper-story windows during urban combat. Rain fell directly onto the gun crew. Mortar fragments entered unimpeded. The psychological impact of sitting exposed during an artillery barrage couldn't be quantified on specification sheets, but every crew member felt it in their gut during combat. When observers from the Ordnance Department first examined the completed prototype at General Motors' Proving Ground in October 1942, they walked around the vehicle shaking their heads in disbelief. The armor thickness seemed criminally inadequate for a combat vehicle expected to engage the most dangerous tanks in the German arsenal. The open turret appeared to be a death sentence during any artillery engagement or infantry close assault. But then someone asked the test driver to demonstrate acceleration from a standing start, and suddenly the compromises made sense in ways that specification sheets couldn't capture. The 18-ton vehicle hit 30 miles per hour in 11 seconds flat. It topped out at 55 on paved roads, a speed no tracked vehicle in the world could match. Nothing with treads came close. The engineering was brilliantly pragmatic in ways that reflected American industrial philosophy. Where Sherman tanks used massive cast hulls that required industrial forges and weeks of production time, the M18 used welded rolled steel plates that any competent shipyard could fabricate using existing equipment. The Wright 975 radial engine was already in mass production for training aircraft. Continental Motors simply adapted it for ground use, producing a lightweight 400 horsepower plant that weighed half what a conventional tank engine did. The Torquematic automatic transmission represented genuine innovation in armored vehicle design. It eliminated the need for trained drivers to master complex gear shifting under combat stress, reducing training time and improving reliability. A crew could be trained on basic M18 operation in 2 weeks instead of 2 months, critical when the demand for tank destroyer battalions was outstripping the supply of qualified personnel. Everything about the design prioritized getting lethal vehicles to the front quickly, over building indestructible fortresses slowly. The 76mm M1A1 gun was the Hellcat's fangs, the same weapon that would later be retrofitted into upgunned Sherman tanks. Firing a 17-pound armor-piercing round at 2,600 feet per second, it could penetrate roughly 3 inches of vertical steel at 500 yards, enough to crack open the side or rear of any German tank in service and threaten even the frontal armor of lighter panzers. The gun's relatively light weight compared to heavier anti-tank weapons meant the turret could traverse a full 360 degrees in 20 seconds, critical for the rapid engagement and disengagement tactics the vehicle was built around. 55 rounds of ammunition sat in racks inside the hull, enough for a full day's hunting before resupply became necessary. But that open turret sparked endless debate during development and would continue generating controversy throughout the war. Engineers argued it saved 3 tons of weight that translated directly into speed and mobility. It simplified production enormously, eliminating complex turret ring seals, vision ports to machine, and power traverse systems struggling under heavy roof weight. Crews could bail out in under 4 seconds if the vehicle took a catastrophic hit, compared to 15 seconds or more in a buttoned-up Sherman, where tankers had to squeeze through narrow hatches while fire and smoke filled the fighting compartment. In the sweltering heat of summer combat, particularly during the Italian campaign, that open top was the difference between functional crews and men passing out from heatstroke after hours inside a steel oven. Critics countered that every artillery airburst, every sniper with a good angle, every strafing run by enemy aircraft had a clear shot at the men inside. German infantry learned quickly that M18s were vulnerable to rifle and machine gun fire from elevated positions. A single well-placed round could kill the commander or gunner, leaving the crew leaderless or unable to engage targets. In practice, both sides were right, and crews learned to love and curse that open sky in equal measure, depending on what was trying to kill them on any given day. The vulnerability to indirect fire was real and measurable. The 893rd Tank Destroyer Battalion took brutal casualties from artillery and tree bursts during the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, losing 16 of 24 M18s primarily to overhead fragmentation rather than direct anti-tank fire. But the visibility advantages were equally real. Hellcat commanders could see the battlefield with clarity that fully enclosed vehicles couldn't match, spotting threats and opportunities that would have remained invisible behind periscopes and vision blocks. Communication with accompanying infantry was direct and natural, rather than requiring intercoms and external phones. And when things went catastrophically wrong, as they did with disturbing frequency in armoured combat, those extra seconds of bailout time saved lives. Production began at Buick's Flint facility in July 1943, and the assembly lines achieved remarkable efficiency almost immediately. By the time production ended in October 1944, Buick had delivered 2,507 M18s at a cost of roughly $55,000 each, half the price of a Sherman and a quarter the cost of a heavy tank. The first units reached Europe in March 1944, just in time for the Italian campaign where 5 prototype T-70 models saw combat at Anzio. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, tank destroyer battalions equipped with Hellcats were training in England, waiting for their chance to prove that speed and firepower could beat armour and mass on the killing fields of France. The proof would come in villages with names most Americans couldn't pronounce, measured in burning panzers and 30-second escapes that became the difference between survival and catastrophic loss. The morning of September 19, 1944 dawned cold and grey across the rolling farmland near Réchicourt in northeastern France. Dense fog reduced visibility to 50 yards, turning the landscape into a featureless grey void where shapes emerged as menacing shadows before resolving into trees, farm buildings, or the lethal silhouettes of armoured vehicles. For the crews of Company C, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to the 4th Armoured Division's Combat Command A, the fog represented both opportunity and danger. It concealed their positions from German observers, but it also meant they couldn't see threats until they were practically on top of them. In the close-range engagements the fog forced, the M18's speed advantage meant less, and its armour disadvantage meant everything. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper's platoon had moved into position on Hill 246 just after 7:45 that morning, occupying firing positions that offered clear sight lines down the slope toward Réchicourt-la-Petite. The Hellcats sat hull down, using the terrain to conceal their lower hulls, while their guns could engage targets approaching from the village. Intelligence reports indicated German armour was concentrating in the area. The 113th Panzer Brigade, equipped with brand-new Panther tanks, was pushing west as part of a larger German counteroffensive, designed to blunt Patton's Third Army advance and recapture the town of Lunéville. The Panthers represented the cutting edge of German armoured technology, 45-ton monsters with frontal armour up to 4 inches thick, sloped at angles that made it functionally impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons. The Panther's 75mm high-velocity gun could kill a Sherman at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Its combination of firepower, protection, and reasonable mobility made it the most feared tank in the Wehrmacht arsenal, respected even by veteran American tankers who had learned through bitter experience that frontal engagements with Panthers usually ended one way. Leiper understood his tactical mathematics with brutal clarity. His 76mm gun couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armour at any practical combat range using standard ammunition. Even the theoretically improved high-velocity armour-piercing rounds that were just beginning to reach units in small quantities offered only marginal improvement, perhaps giving his gun a chance against frontal turret armour at under 300 yards if he was lucky, and the angle was perfect. Side and rear shots at ranges under 800 yards were different stories entirely. The Panther's side armour measured less than 2 inches, sloped but thin enough that his gun could punch through reliably. The rear armour was even thinner, and the engine deck was vulnerable to plunging fire that could disable the vehicle even without full penetration. So the tactical calculus was simple. even if the execution was terrifying. Don't engage Panthers frontally. Use speed to achieve positional advantage. Shoot from the flank or rear. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Disengage immediately before the Panther's turret could traverse onto your position. Move to a new firing position before German artillery could range your last location. Repeat until the target was destroyed, or you were. When that first Panther emerged from the fog 30 feet away, Leiper didn't hesitate. His gunner, who had been scanning through his telescopic sight, had the target acquired before the lieutenant's fire order reached completion. The M18's gun fired, the sound oddly flat in the fog-dampened air. The Panther shuddered, stopped, then erupted as internal ammunition cooked off. But the shot had revealed their position, and 4 more Panthers were now visible, their commanders searching for the source of fire. Leiper's driver already had the Hellcat in motion, reversing at speed that threw the crew against their positions. The right radial engine screamed at full power, propelling the vehicle backward and then laterally, using terrain folds to break line of sight. Within 5 minutes, Leiper's platoon had knocked out 5 German tanks of the 113th Panzer Brigade, losing 1 M18 to return fire when the vehicle hesitated too long admiring its kill. The surviving Hellcats continued engaging, moving between pre-selected firing positions like chess pieces in a deadly game where hesitation meant instant death. The platoon destroyed 10 more German tanks over the next hour, while losing another 2 M18s to German fire. One of Leiper's platoon vehicles, commanded by Sergeant Henry R. Hartmann, knocked out 6 Panthers individually, most of them the much-feared Panther variant, using textbook shoot and scoot tactics that would later be taught at armor schools as examples of proper doctrine execution. Hartmann's kills illustrated the M18 doctrine working exactly as designed: spot the target from concealment, maneuver to achieve favorable angle while the enemy remained unaware, fire from the flank or rear, immediately displace before return fire arrived, reset in a new position several hundred yards away. Repeat. The German tank commanders, accustomed to frontal engagements where their superior armor and guns gave them decisive advantages, found themselves fighting ghosts that appeared, killed, and vanished before effective response was possible. When they turned to engage, the Hellcats were gone. When they advanced to clear suspected positions, they exposed their flanks to new firing positions. By the time the Battle of Réchicourt concluded 3 days later, on September 22nd, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had knocked out 39 German tanks and numerous other armoured vehicles, for the loss of 4 M18s destroyed and 3 more damaged. The kill ratio, better than 8-to-1 accounting only for total losses, shocked both American and German observers who understood the implications. Panthers that should have dominated the battlefield based on their superior armour and firepower instead burned in French fields, victims of flanking shots they never saw coming from an enemy that refused to fight on German terms. The Hellcat crews hadn't tried to match Panther capabilities in frontal slugging matches. They had changed the geometry of every engagement, using speed and positioning to negate the German advantages while maximising their own. Captain James Leach's Company C caught a formation of 8 Panthers moving through an open field near Réchicourt on the morning of September 20th. His 4 Hellcats were positioned along a tree line, spacing themselves 200 yards apart to avoid concentrated return fire. The lead Panther never saw them until Leach's gunner put a round through its engine deck at 600 yards, setting it ablaze and blocking the advance route. The following Panthers pivoted to engage, but Leach's vehicles were already displacing, racing laterally behind the tree line, while his other crews fired into the German formation from new angles. Within 4 minutes, 5 Panthers were burning. The surviving 3 retreated, their crews shaken by an enemy they couldn't pin down long enough to kill. German after-action reports from the Battle of Réchicourt complained repeatedly about facing an unusually high concentration of anti-tank weapons and highly mobile artillery positions. They didn't realize they'd been fighting 36 vehicles that kept repositioning to create the illusion of a much larger force. The psychological impact of the Hellcat tactics exceeded even their material effectiveness. German tank commanders became cautious, wary of advancing through terrain where American tank destroyers might be waiting in ambush. The aggressive exploitation that German doctrine emphasized became harder to execute when every advance risked encountering an enemy that could appear from unexpected angles, fire with devastating effect, and vanish before effective counterattack. The tactical intelligence gathered at Réchicourt validated the entire tank destroyer concept in ways that silenced critics within the army who had questioned whether lightly armored vehicles could survive against heavy German tanks. Speed and aggression had beaten armor and firepower. Shoot and scoot wasn't just theoretical doctrine anymore. It was proven methodology written in burning panzers and the survival of crews who trusted their training over their fear. But Réchicourt was September, and the war wasn't over. In December, when German forces launched their last desperate offensive through the Ardennes forests in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Hellcat crews would face their most severe test yet, rushed into defensive positions around a small Belgian town called Bastogne, where 7 main roads converged, and where the fate of the entire German counter-offensive would be decided in brutal close-quarters fighting that gave M18s little room to maneuver. December 18, 1944. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion was positioned 60 miles north of Bastogne, in reserve, and expecting a quiet period to rest and refit after weeks of grinding combat along the German border. Then the urgent orders arrived. German forces had launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes, and American forces were reeling from the unexpected assault. The 705th, under Lieutenant Colonel Clifford D. Templeton's command, was ordered south immediately to provide anti-tank support to the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. The situation was desperate and confused. German armoured spearheads were driving deep into American positions, aiming to capture the critical road junction at Bastogne before American forces could organise effective defence. The battalion moved south through the evening of December 18th and all through December 19th, racing to reach Bastogne before German forces could encircle it completely. The high-speed road march was one of the few documented instances where the M18's legendary 55-mile-per-hour top speed was actually used operationally, rather than just demonstrated during tests. Templeton's combat elements reached Bastogne late on the night of December 19th, arriving just ahead of German forces that were converging on the town from multiple directions. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed to Bastogne with similar urgency, was arriving throughout the night and morning of December 20th. The paratroopers were elite infantry, but they lacked armour and heavy anti-tank weapons. The 705th's 36 M18 Hellcats would provide the primary armoured punch for the defence. On the morning of December 20th, a platoon of 4 M18s was sent north from Bastogne to help relieve Task Force Desaubry, defending the northeast approaches to the town around the village of Neuville. German 2nd Panzer Division was pushing hard toward Neuville, determined to seize the road junction and continue the advance toward the Meuse River. The 4 Hellcats, accompanying a battalion of paratroopers from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, blunted the attack of 2nd Panzer Division in fighting that would later be analysed as a textbook example of combined arms defence. The tank destroyers and paratroopers together destroyed at least 30 German tanks and inflicted between 500 and 1,000 casualties on the attacking forces in what amounted to a spoiling attack that bought crucial time. The Hellcats used the broken terrain around Neuville to devastating effect, appearing from unexpected positions to fire into the flanks of German tanks, then withdrawing before concentrated return fire could destroy them. The paratroopers used their bazookas and anti-tank grenades at close range, forcing German armour to button up and limiting visibility, which made them more vulnerable to the tank destroyers' long-range fire. The defence of Neuville deceived the German commander into believing the village was being held by a much stronger force than actually occupied it. The heavy losses and stubborn resistance convinced him to pause and reorganise rather than pushing immediately through to Bastogne. That delay gave the 101st Airborne Division enough time to organise comprehensive defences around Bastogne itself before German forces completed the encirclement on December 20th. Throughout the siege that followed, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion was formally attached to the 101st Airborne and provided the primary armoured capability for the defence. On December 21st, the total armoured reserve available to the 101st, other than the 705th, amounted to about 40 operable medium tanks, and many of those were damaged or low on fuel and ammunition. The M18s were distributed between the 101st's regiments, with platoons attached to different defensive sectors around the perimeter. A platoon went to the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. 2 platoons supported the 506th, 2 more attached to the 502nd. 4 platoons deployed with the 327th Glider Infantry. 1 platoon remained as a mobile reserve in the town itself, ready to rush to threatened sectors as the situation developed. On Christmas Day, December 25th, the 705th was engaged in the throes of the most intense fighting during the siege. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division launched a major attack with 18 Panzer IV tanks, attempting to break through American positions and reach the centre of Bastogne. M18s of the 705th met the attack with devastating effect. The Hellcats engaged the Panzers at ranges where their 76mm guns remained effective, targeting the Panzer IV's thinner side armour as the German tanks manoeuvred through the broken terrain around Bastogne. Paratrooper bazooka teams worked in coordination with the tank destroyers, forcing German armour to choose between multiple threats from different directions. By the end of Christmas Day fighting, M18s were credited with destroying 27 German tanks, with only 6 Hellcats lost. The kill ratio, better than 4-1 even in defensive fighting where the M18's speed advantages were partially negated, demonstrated that the Hellcat remained lethal, even when doctrine couldn't be executed perfectly. Sergeant Lawrence Valletta's M18 from the Reconnaissance Company exemplified the Hellcat's effectiveness during the Bastogne fighting. When German forces penetrated defences near the village of Champs on December 24th, Valletta's tank destroyer rolled into the village and systematically destroyed German strongpoints that were pinning down American infantry. He moved toward a stone house sheltering approximately 30 German soldiers and blew it apart with high-explosive rounds. Further up the road, he destroyed 2 more houses being used as firing positions. At dawn, he shelled a 4th. By the time he finished his rampage through Champs, Valletta had smashed 4 machine gun nests and wiped out several hiding places for enemy infantry, all while his open-topped turret left him vulnerable to return fire. Staff Sergeant Donald Williams commanded a section from 3rd Platoon C Company during fighting near the crossroads south of Roll. When German panzers appeared, Williams manoeuvred his 2 tank destroyers through woods to attack a troublesome Panther from its rear. Before he could fire, nearby paratroopers forced the Panther out of cover with bazooka fire. Williams sent several anti-tank rounds, slamming into the retreating tank, destroying it. More panzers appeared immediately, rolling toward the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment's headquarters. Williams repositioned again, using the same terrain folds and tree lines that provided concealment while allowing clear firing lanes. The combination of Hellcat mobility and paratrooper close assault capability made German armour operations around Bastogne far more costly than German commanders had anticipated. Throughout the siege, which lasted until December 27th when elements of Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve Bastogne, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed approximately 40 German tanks while losing only 6 M18s. The battalion's performance during the Bastogne fighting was recognized with the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the Army's highest unit awards. The defense of Bastogne demonstrated that M18 Hellcats remained effective even in conditions that negated some of their primary advantages. The close terrain around the town limited the utility of their top speed. The defensive posture meant they couldn't always choose engagement angles. German forces had the initiative and could concentrate overwhelming force at selected points. Yet the Hellcats still achieved impressive kill ratios through aggressive positioning, coordination with infantry, and crews who understood that speed meant more than just velocity on roads. It meant speed of decision-making, speed of target acquisition, speed of engagement, and speed of repositioning after firing. Those mental and tactical speeds mattered as much as mechanical speed during the grinding defensive battle. By early 1945, the M18 Hellcat had proven itself in combat far beyond what early skeptics thought possible. The vehicle that critics called a mobile coffin, that engineers worried was too lightly armored to survive, had achieved kill-to-loss ratios that exceeded any other American tank or tank destroyer in the European theatre. Final statistics told a story that numbers couldn't fully capture. M18 Hellcats claimed 526 kills total during World War II, 498 in Europe, 17 in Italy, and 11 in the Pacific theatre. The overall kill-to-loss ratio stood at approximately 2.4 to 1, but that figure understated the Hellcat's effectiveness because it included losses to non-combat causes and counted vehicles damaged but recovered and repaired. In actual combat engagements where tactical circumstances allowed proper doctrine, execution, like Réchicourt, the ratios climbed dramatically higher. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion reported destroying upward of 90 enemy armoured fighting vehicles during the war in Europe, while losing far fewer M18s to enemy action. But the statistical success masked persistent problems that would dog the M18 throughout its service life. The 76mm gun remained inadequate against heavy German armour in frontal engagements. Panthers and Tigers were effectively invulnerable from the front at anything beyond point-blank range, unless crews had access to the scarce high-velocity armour-piercing ammunition that was never available in sufficient quantity. Crews learned through bitter experience that frontal shots on heavy German tanks were suicide gambles. The round would bounce off the sloped armour, revealing the Hellcat's position to an enemy that could respond with devastating effect. Side and rear shots at ranges under 800 yards were the only reliable way to kill heavy German armour with the weapons available. The open turret remained controversial throughout the war. Units operating in the Pacific theatre particularly disliked the configuration, because Japanese infantry tactics emphasized close assault. The vulnerability to grenades, snipers, and small arms fire in jungle terrain, where overhead cover was everywhere, made crews feel exposed and vulnerable in ways that European terrain didn't necessarily create. Artillery remained the Hellcat's most dangerous enemy throughout the war. The 893rd Tank Destroyer Battalion's experience in the Hurtgen Forest, where they lost 16 of 24 M18s, primarily to artillery tree bursts, rather than direct anti-tank fire, illustrated the open turret's fundamental vulnerability to indirect fire. German artillery crews learned to target probable tank destroyer positions with airburst shells that showered fragments downward into open turrets. A single well-placed salvo could kill or wound an entire crew without ever scoring a direct hit on the vehicle itself. The psychological strain of sitting exposed during artillery barrages affected crew performance in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Yet despite these limitations, crews generally preferred the M18 to the alternatives. When given a choice between the M10 Wolverine with its 3-inch gun and fully enclosed turret and the M18 with its open top but superior mobility, most experienced crews chose the Hellcat. The speed differential was simply too valuable tactically. The ability to dictate engagement terms, to shoot and immediately reposition before return fire arrived, kept crews alive in ways that thicker armour never could. The M18's influence extended far beyond its relatively brief combat service. The doctrine it validated, speed and positioning over armour and firepower in direct comparison, would influence anti-tank thinking for decades. Modern tank destroyers barely resemble the M18 mechanically, but the DNA remains unmistakable in their tactical employment. The Swedish IKV-91 light tank, introduced in the 1970s, carried a 90mm gun on a chassis that could swim and maxed out at 43 miles per hour. Lighter and faster than main battle tanks, designed to ambush Soviet armour in Scandinavian forests before vanishing into terrain, it embodied Hellcat principles translated into Cold War context. The Italian B-1 Centauro, wheeled tank destroyer entering service in 1991, mounted a 100-5mm gun on an 8-wheeled chassis, capable of 62 miles per hour on roads. Explicitly designed for hit-and-run tactics in defensive operations, it would have been instantly recognizable to any Hellcat veteran as intellectual descendant, if not mechanical heir. Even modern anti-tank warfare at the individual soldier level reflects Hellcat principles that were proven in French fields and Belgian forests. Ukrainian forces using Javelin and NLAW missiles against Russian armor in 2022 employed textbook shoot-and-scoot tactics that any M18 commander from 1944 would recognize instantly: fire from concealed positions, then displace before Russian artillery or drones could target the launch site. The technology changed from mechanical to digital, from gunpowder to rocket motors, but the core concept remained unchanged. Mobility beats armor when you control the terms of engagement. The M18's production run ended in October 1944 after just 2,507 units had been built, far fewer than the originally planned 8,986 vehicles. The truncated production reflected changing priorities as the war progressed, and the realization that the M36 Jackson with its 90mm gun offered better capability against late-war German heavy armor, but the vehicles that did reach frontline units punched far above their weight in combat effectiveness. The 603rd and 704th Tank Destroyer Battalions each reported destroying upward of 90 enemy armored fighting vehicles during the European campaign. The 705th's performance at Bastogne earned a Presidential Unit citation that recognized not just courage but devastating effectiveness in the most difficult defensive fighting of the war. The crews who operated M18s developed a particular mindset that set them apart from conventional tankers. They understood viscerally that their survival depended on never being where the enemy expected, never staying in one position long enough to become targeted, and never accepting a fair fight when tactical geometry offered alternatives. Tank crews in Shermans or heavier vehicles could afford to trade blows with enemy armor, absorbing hits while returning fire. Hellcat crews couldn't. A single penetrating hit would likely kill the vehicle and everyone inside. The thin armor that enabled their speed also meant that mistakes were instantly fatal in ways that Sherman crews could sometimes survive. This reality bred a combination of aggression and caution that seemed contradictory, but worked in practice. Hellcat crews were aggressive in seeking engagement, actively hunting enemy armor rather than waiting for it to appear. But they were cautious about how they engaged, never accepting unfavorable tactical geometry when repositioning could improve their angle of attack. The psychological profile required to thrive in a Hellcat was different from conventional tank crews. It required accepting vulnerability as a constant condition, while maintaining the confidence to engage targets that outweighed your vehicle by 20 tons and mounted guns that could destroy you with a single hit. It required trusting doctrine absolutely, believing that speed and positioning would keep you alive when armor wouldn't. Technical Sergeant James Flowers, who served with the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion through the entire European campaign, survived the war after watching his original crew get replaced multiple times due to casualties. When interviewed in 1945, he put the Hellcat philosophy into blunt terms that captured the mentality perfectly. "I'll take speed over armor any day," Flowers said. "Armor just means you take longer to die when they hit you. Speed means maybe they don't hit you at all." That statement, stripped of military jargon and tactical theory, encapsulated the entire M18 concept. The vehicle was designed around a fundamental gamble that avoiding hits mattered more than surviving them. The combat record suggests the gamble paid off more often than not, at least when crews executed doctrine properly and tactical circumstances allowed the mobility advantages to matter. After the war ended in May 1945, the United States immediately began scrapping tank destroyer battalions as the specialized anti-tank mission disappeared with the German surrender. The M18s were consolidated, with most going to scrapyards or sold as surplus to Allied nations desperate for armored vehicles to rebuild their militaries. Yugoslavia kept M18s in frontline service until 1952, using them in border security roles where speed mattered more than armor protection. The vehicles fit perfectly into Yugoslav doctrine that emphasized light, mobile forces capable of responding quickly to threats across mountainous terrain where heavy tanks would have struggled. Venezuela operated Hellcats until the late 1950s, valuing them as fast response vehicles for a military that had no realistic armored threat to face, but needed something intimidating for internal security and ceremonial purposes. Even Pakistan acquired a handful in the 1950s, though they saw limited use. The M39 armoured utility vehicle, a turretless M18 variant converted to carry personnel and equipment, saw service in the Korean War, starting in 1950. 640 M18s were converted to M39 configuration between October 1944 and March 1945. The vehicles served as command posts, prime movers, and armoured personnel carriers, proving that the basic M18 chassis retained utility even when the original tank destroyer mission had evolved beyond its capabilities. But the real legacy of the M18 Hellcat wasn't measured in vehicles that survived into the 1950s or the handful that ended up in museums. The legacy was doctrinal, the validation of a tactical philosophy that prioritized mobility and positioning over protection and direct firepower comparison. The tank destroyer concept itself was abandoned by the United States Army shortly after World War II. The specialized anti-tank branch was dissolved, with tank destroyer units either deactivated or converted to conventional armor or artillery. The Army concluded that main battle tanks could handle the anti-armor mission without requiring specialized vehicles and separate organizational structures. But the tactical lessons the M18 taught remained embedded in American armor doctrine. The emphasis on maneuver warfare, the understanding that speed creates tactical options that armor cannot, the recognition that controlling engagement geometry matters as much as raw firepower, these concepts became foundational to American armored thinking during the Cold War and beyond. When American forces developed doctrine for combating numerically superior Soviet armor during the Cold War, the plans emphasized mobility, superior positioning, and ambush tactics over trying to match Soviet tank production numbers. The ghost of the Hellcat haunted those planning documents, even if no one explicitly acknowledged it. Modern American armored cavalry doctrine, with its emphasis on reconnaissance, rapid maneuver, and striking from unexpected angles rather than frontal assault, owes intellectual debts to the tank destroyer force that the M18 represented. The terminology changed, the equipment evolved beyond recognition, but the underlying tactical philosophy that speed and positioning can defeat heavier opponents remained constant. The handful of M18 Hellcats that survive today in museums stand as physical reminders of a particular moment in military technology when speed reached its apex as armor's primary defense. Walking around one at the United States Army Armor and Cavalry Collection at Fort Moore, Georgia, the thin armor and open turret look almost fragile compared to modern armored vehicles, with their composite armor and advanced protection systems. But reading the placard describing its combat record, the numbers tell a different story. Fastest tracked vehicle of World War II, 5-to-1 kill ratios in optimal conditions, 30-second displacement doctrine that saved thousands of crew lives. The M18 Hellcat wasn't the best tank destroyer because it had the thickest armor or the biggest gun. It was the best because it taught everyone who came after that sometimes the best armor is not being there when the enemy shoots. The morning of September 19th, 1944, when Lieutenant Edwin Leiper watched that first Panther emerge from the fog 30 feet away, represented more than just another combat engagement in a war filled with them. It represented the moment when American doctrine met German armor on terms that Americans had chosen, fighting the battle on American terms rather than accepting German advantages as inevitable. The Panther that morning had every advantage the German military-industrial complex could provide. Superior armor that American guns couldn't penetrate frontally, a more powerful main gun with longer effective range, better optics, more combat-experienced crews. It should have dominated any encounter with a lightly armored American tank destroyer, but it didn't, because Leiper's M18 was never where the Panther expected it to be. The Hellcat appeared, killed, and vanished before German tactical responses could develop. That cycle repeated hundreds of times across the battlefields of France, Belgium, and Germany during the final year of the war. Panthers burned, Tigers were knocked out, Panzer IVs were destroyed by vehicles that weighed half as much and carried armor measured in fractions of inches rather than multiple inches. The M18 Hellcat proved that in armored warfare, as in so many other aspects of combat, Speed kills more effectively than weight. Positioning matters more than protection. The ability to dictate when and where you fight trumps the ability to absorb punishment. These weren't new insights. Military theorists had understood them intellectually for generations. But the Hellcat demonstrated them practically in ways that couldn't be dismissed as theoretical or situational. Sergeant Henry Hartman, who knocked out 6 Panthers in a single engagement near Réchicourt, embodied what the Hellcat made possible. He wasn't in a heavier tank with thicker armor. He wasn't firing a more powerful gun. He was operating a vehicle that let him fight smarter rather than harder, using geometry and velocity to achieve results that direct combat couldn't deliver. When the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion's M18s helped hold Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, destroying approximately 40 German tanks while losing only 6 Hellcats, they validated the entire tank destroyer concept under the worst possible conditions. The close terrain negated their speed advantages. The defensive mission limited their tactical flexibility. German forces held the initiative and could mass overwhelming combat power at selected points. Yet the Hellcats still achieved impressive results because their crews understood that doctrine was more than just mechanical speed. It was speed of thinking, speed of reacting, speed of adapting to changing tactical circumstances. Those mental speeds mattered as much as the 55-mile-per-hour top speed during defensive fighting, where physical velocity offered limited advantages. The open turret that killed crews during artillery barrages also saved lives when vehicles took catastrophic hits, and bailout time measured the difference between survival and incineration. The thin armor that made every engagement a knife fight at close range also enabled the mobility that kept experienced crews alive through dozens of engagements. The 76mm gun that couldn't penetrate heavy German armor frontally still killed Panthers and Tigers when crews maneuvered for side and rear shots. Every compromise the M18's designers made, every capability sacrificed to maximize speed, proved justified in combat when crews executed doctrine properly. Not every engagement ended favorably. Not every crew survived. The 893rd Tank Destroyer Battalion's casualties in Hurtgen Forest demonstrated that doctrine couldn't overcome every tactical disadvantage. But across thousands of engagements throughout the European theatre, the M18 delivered results that far exceeded what its specifications suggested possible. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the M18 Hellcat had established itself as the most effective American tank destroyer of World War II by any statistical measure. The kill-to-loss ratios exceeded the M10 Wolverine and the M36 Jackson, despite mounting a less powerful gun than the Jackson's 90mm. The operational flexibility exceeded towed anti-tank guns by enormous margins. The tactical impact exceeded what the relatively small number of vehicles deployed should have achieved. The M18 succeeded because American doctrine writers in 1941, watching newsreels of German panzers racing across France, asked themselves a question that military establishments rarely ask. What if we can't match the enemy's strengths directly? What if we have to find a different way to win? What if speed matters more than armor? Those questions led to the tank destroyer force, to the doctrine of seek, strike, destroy, and ultimately to the M18 Hellcat screaming across French fields at 55 miles per hour, hunting tanks that weighed twice as much and should have been able to kill it with a single shot. The fact that those heavy tanks burned instead, that M18 crews survived encounters that should have been suicide missions, that American tank destroyers achieved decisive results despite obvious vulnerabilities, validated the entire conceptual framework. The M18 Hellcat taught the American military, and eventually every other military that studied its combat record, that in armored warfare, as in life, the best defense is sometimes not being there when the attack arrives. That lesson, purchased with the lives of tank destroyer crews who trusted their speed more than their armor, remains relevant today, in an era when anti-tank guided missiles travel at supersonic velocities and main battle tanks mount reactive armor and active protection systems. Modern tank destroyer don't look like M18 Hellcats. They mount wheels instead of tracks, fire missiles instead of shells, and incorporate digital systems that would seem like science fiction to World War II crews. but the tactical DNA remains unmistakable. Position for advantage. Fire with devastating effect. Displace immediately. Repeat until the mission is complete or circumstances demand withdrawal. That cycle, perfected on the killing fields of France and Belgium during 1944, continues to define effective anti-armor operations in the 21st century. The M18 Hellcat is gone, relegated to museums and history books and the memories of aging veterans who understood what it meant to trust your speed when armor wouldn't save you. But the doctrine it validated, the tactical philosophy it proved, and the fundamental insight it demonstrated, that mobility beats protection when you control the terms of engagement, those legacies endure. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.